December 18th, 1944, 06:15 hours. Stalag 9C, Bad Sulza, Germany. Dr. Natalia Kozlova stood in the freezing roll call line with 217 other female prisoners, her hands wrapped in strips of torn cloth to protect fingers that had once commanded concert halls across 3 continents. She was 34 years old. Before the war, she had been one of the finest classical pianists in the Soviet Union. Now she was prisoner number 47291, and her hands were dying. Natalia was not supposed to be here. Concert pianists did not become prisoners of war. Concert pianists evacuated when the Germans advanced. They fled to Moscow, to Tashkent, to anywhere the Wehrmacht couldn't reach. They were too valuable, too symbolic of Soviet culture, too important to lose. But Natalia had made a choice that seemed insane to everyone who knew her. Her colleagues at the Leningrad Conservatory, her friends in the party, even her own mother, who begged her to evacuate. When the Germans surrounded Leningrad in September 1941, beginning the 900-day siege that would kill more than 1 million people through starvation, disease, and bombardment, Natalia stayed. Not because she was trapped, not because she missed the opportunity. She had been offered evacuation 3 times. The Commissariat of Culture had personally sent a car with a driver who waited for 2 hours while she packed, then unpacked, then decided to stay. The commissar himself had called her. "Comrade Kozlova, you are a national treasure. You must evacuate. This is not a request." But her students were still in the city. 72 children from the Leningrad Conservatory, ages 8 to 17, who she had taught to play Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky. Children whose parents were fighting at the front, working in munitions factories, dying in hospitals. Children who had no one else. "I cannot leave while my children are still here," she had told the evacuation officer, standing in her apartment with her suitcase open but empty. Who will teach them? Who will remind them that beauty still exists when everything around them is death and destruction? If we abandon beauty, we abandon what makes us human. And then, Hitler has already won. So she stayed, and she taught. In freezing classrooms where you could see your breath even at midday, where the windows were shattered from bomb blasts and covered with cardboard. In apartments lit by candles because the power grid had failed and where oil lamps were considered luxury items. In bomb shelters, while German artillery shelled the city with a regularity you could almost set your watch by. The evening bombardment always came between 1800 and 1900 hours, as reliable as clockwork. She taught children to play piano on instruments that were falling apart because there was no one to repair them and no parts to use for repairs. In a city that was dying block by block, where the dead lay in the streets because no one had strength to bury them. Because she believed with religious fervor that music was the thing that separated humans from animals, civilization from barbarism, life from mere survival. She survived on rations of 125 grams of bread per day, 4 slices. She watched her weight drop from 62 kilograms to 43. She saw her students die one by one. Malnutrition, disease, artillery strikes. By spring 1942, only 19 of her 72 students were still alive. But she kept teaching, and on August 9, 1942, she organized a concert in the middle of a siege, in a city where people were dying by the thousands. She gathered her surviving students, and they performed Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, arranged for piano, in a basement shelter, while German shells fell on the streets above. The concert lasted 47 minutes. No one who attended would ever forget it. The music was defiant. It was hope carved from despair. It was the sound of civilization refusing to die. A German officer heard about the concert, not because of military intelligence, but because one of the attendees mentioned it in a letter that was intercepted. The officer's name was Standartenführer Heinrich Brandt. He was head of cultural suppression for occupied territories. His job was to eliminate Soviet morale by destroying cultural symbols, and he decided that Natalia Kozlova was a symbol that needed to be destroyed. They arrested her in October 1942, charged her with anti-German propaganda through music. The trial lasted 17 minutes. The sentence was imprisonment in a labor camp for the duration of the war. But Brandt did something unusual. Instead of sending her to a standard labor camp where she would probably die within months from malnutrition and overwork, he sent her to Stalag 9C, a prisoner of war camp, specifically to the women's section, because he had a plan. Stalag 9C held approximately 3,000 prisoners in December 1944. 2,400 men, 600 women. Most were Soviet, some were Polish, a few were French resistance fighters. The conditions were brutal. Food rations were 700 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. No heat, no medical care beyond basic first aid. Disease was rampant: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The average life expectancy for a prisoner at Stalag 9C was 14 months. Natalia had been there for 26 months. She had survived through a combination of luck, stubbornness, and the protection of other prisoners who knew who she was. Her fame had followed her even into the camp. Prisoners whispered her name. The pianist from Leningrad, the one who stayed, the one who played while the city burned. But her hands were dying. In a labor camp, hands were tools. Natalia's job was sorting scrap metal in an unheated warehouse. 8 hours per day, 6 days per week, handling sharp metal edges in temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing. Her fingers had developed chronic frostbite. The tissue was damaged. Circulation was impaired. 2 fingers on her left hand had lost sensation completely. Every night, she looked at her hands and wondered if she would ever play again. If civilization survived this war, if Germany was defeated, if she somehow lived through this nightmare, would her hands remember what they once could do? The humiliation came on December 18, 1944. The camp commandant, Obersturmbannführer Karl Hoffmann, had received orders from Berlin. The war was not going well for Germany. The Red Army was advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Morale among German troops was collapsing. The leadership in Berlin wanted propaganda, something to show that German culture was superior, that Soviet prisoners were inferior, that Germany would still win. Hoffmann decided to stage a concert, not for the prisoners, for the German guards and officers. A Christmas celebration. They would bring in a proper German pianist to play proper German music, Wagner, Beethoven, Bach, and the prisoners would be forced to watch, to see what true culture looked like, to understand their inferiority. But then Hoffmann had a better idea, a crueler one. He would force Natalia to play. The announcement came during morning roll call. Hoffmann stood on the platform with a loudspeaker, his breath visible in the frozen air. Prisoner 47291, Natalia Kozlova, step forward. Natalia's heart stopped. In a concentration camp, being singled out usually meant death, execution, special punishment, deportation to an extermination camp. She stepped forward. Her legs shook, not from fear, but from malnutrition. She weighed 39 kilograms now. Her body was consuming itself. "You were a pianist," Hoffmann said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Herr Obersturmbannführer. You will perform a concert, tomorrow evening, for the German officers and guards. You will play German music, Wagner, Beethoven. If you refuse, you will be shot. If you perform badly, you will be shot. If you attempt to play any Soviet music, you will be shot, and 10 other prisoners will be shot with you. The silence that followed was absolute. 217 women stood frozen. Natalia could hear her own heartbeat. "Do you understand?" Hoffmann asked. "Yes, Herr Obersturmbannführer." "Good. You have 24 hours to prepare. There is a piano in the officers' club. You will practice there under guard. Dismissed." That afternoon, they took Natalia to the officers' club. It was warm. Actually warm. There was a fireplace. The temperature was maybe 18 degrees Celsius. After 2 years of freezing constantly, the warmth was almost painful. In the center of the room sat a Bechstein grand piano, model D280, built in 1936, ebony finish. It was beautiful, maintained, tuned, a German officer's luxury in the middle of hell. Natalia approached it like a sacred object. Her hands were shaking. She unwrapped the cloth strips. Her fingers were swollen, discolored. The nails were split and broken. She sat on the bench, positioned her hands over the keys, and pressed middle C. The note rang out clear and pure. Perfect pitch, perfect tone. It was the first time in 26 months she had touched a piano. Natalia began to cry, silently. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't make a sound, because the guards were watching, and she would not give them the satisfaction. She played scales. Her fingers barely worked. The damaged tissue, the lost circulation, the muscle atrophy, everything was wrong. What used to be effortless now required concentration, her left hand especially. Those 2 numb fingers wouldn't respond properly. But she played. For 4 hours, under the watch of 2 bored guards who smoked cigarettes and complained about the cold, Natalia Kozlova practiced. By evening, she could barely move her hands. The pain was excruciating. Muscles that hadn't been used properly in 2 years were screaming. But she had played. She had remembered. That night, in the barracks, the other women gathered around her bunk. "What will you do?" asked Irina, a former schoolteacher from Kiev. "I will play what they demand," Natalia said. "What choice do I have?" "You could play badly on purpose," said Katya, a factory worker from Minsk. "They would shoot you, but at least you wouldn't give them what they want." "And they would shoot 10 others with me," Natalia replied. "I will not have that on my conscience." There was silence. Then Maria, a grandmother from a village near Smolensk, spoke. She was the oldest prisoner in the camp, 68 years old. She had survived by sheer stubbornness. "Play for us," Maria said quietly. "Not for them. When you sit at that piano tomorrow, do not see German officers. See your students. See the people of Leningrad who heard you in the siege. Play for the living. Play for the dead. Play so that they know we have not forgotten beauty." Natalia looked at the old woman. "How can I play beauty for men who create this?" She gestured at the barracks, at the women dying slowly, at the hell they all inhabited. "Because that is the one thing they cannot take from you," Maria said. "They can take your freedom, your health, your life, but they cannot take what lives in here." She tapped her chest. "Music is not in your hands. It is in your soul. Your hands are just the tools." December 19th, 1944. 1900 hours. The officers' club was packed. 73 German officers and guards. Drinks were being served. Schnapps. Wine. It was a party. A celebration of German culture in the midst of war. Natalia was brought in under guard. She wore the same filthy, lice-infested camp uniform she had worn for 2 years. Her hair was matted. Her face was gaunt. She looked like a skeleton wrapped in rags. The Germans laughed when they saw her. "This is your famous pianist?" someone said. She looks like she should be dead already." More laughter. Hoffman stood and raised his hand for silence. "Gentlemen, this creature was once considered a great artist by Soviet standards. Tonight, she will demonstrate the superiority of German culture by playing the music of our great composers. If she performs adequately, she will receive an extra ration. If not," he shrugged. Natalia walked to the piano, sat down. Her hands were shaking, not from fear now, but from weakness. She had not eaten in 2 days. They had withheld her rations to motivate her. She looked at the keys, remembered Maria's words. "Play for us, not for them." She closed her eyes, and she saw them, her students, all 72, even the ones who had died. She saw the audience in Leningrad who had risked death to attend a concert during a siege. She saw her teacher, Professor Glazunov, who had taught her that music was prayer made audible. She opened her eyes, placed her hands on the keys, and she played. She started with Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, as ordered. Technically perfect, despite her damaged hands, despite the pain that shot up her arms with each key strike. The Germans nodded approvingly, raising their glasses, smiling at each other. This was what they wanted. Proof of their cultural superiority. See how even a Soviet prisoner acknowledges the greatness of German music. Then she transitioned into Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The third movement. Fast. Technically demanding. Furious arpeggios that required precision she wasn't sure her damaged hands could deliver. But muscle memory took over. Years of practice. Decades of discipline. Her hands screamed in pain, but she pushed through, her fingers finding the notes even when she couldn't feel them properly. The Germans leaned forward in their chairs. This was impressive. Even in her condition, even looking like a concentration camp skeleton, her skill was undeniable. Some looked uncomfortable now. It's harder to think of someone as subhuman when they're demonstrating mastery you could never achieve. And then Natalia did something that would either get her killed or would become legend whispered in camps across occupied Europe. She began to play Shostakovich. Not obviously at first. She was too clever for that. She blended it into the Beethoven so smoothly that it took several bars before anyone with musical training noticed. The Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, the same piece she had performed during the siege, the same music that had defined Soviet resistance, the music that said, "We are still here, we are still human, you cannot break us." The transition was seamless. Beethoven's fury became Shostakovich's defiance. The notes changed, but the emotion intensified. And suddenly the room's atmosphere shifted. Some of the Germans frowned. Something was wrong, but they couldn't quite identify what. Hoffman stood up. His face went red. He knew Shostakovich when he heard it. "Stop! That is not German music. That is forbidden Soviet propaganda." But Natalia didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Her hands moved faster. The music grew louder, more defiant, more alive. It filled the room like a physical force, like rage given sound, like hope carved from despair. It filled every corner, every silence, drowning out the sound of glasses being set down, of chairs scraping backward, of men uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Hoffman drew his Walther P-38 pistol. "I said stop!" The music swelled. Natalia played with her eyes closed. Tears streamed down her face. Her damaged fingers bled onto the white keys, leaving red smears. But she played. And then something miraculous happened. The German guards didn't shoot her. They stood frozen. Because the music was so beautiful, so powerful, so overwhelming, that even men who had been trained to kill without hesitation couldn't pull the trigger. One of the guards, a young corporal named Wilhelm Bauer from Stuttgart, lowered his rifle. He was crying. He would later say that in that moment, hearing that music, He remembered what he had been before the war, before the uniform, before the killing. He remembered his mother playing Schubert on their family piano. He remembered beauty. Hoffman aimed his pistol at Natalia's head. "Stop, or I will shoot you and 10 others." Natalia played the final crescendo. The music reached its peak. Then, silence. She lifted her hands from the keys, looked at Hoffman, and said quietly, in perfect German, "You can shoot me now, but you cannot unhear what you just heard. You cannot unknow that beauty exists, and you cannot ever be clean again." Hoffman's hand shook. The pistol wavered. Every man in that room was staring at him, waiting. And then Hoffman did something no one expected. He lowered the pistol, put it back in his holster, and walked out of the room without a word. The guards stood confused. No one had given them orders. Finally, the senior NCO said, "Return the prisoner to the barracks." Natalia stood. Her legs barely supported her. Blood dripped from her fingers. She had probably destroyed what remained of her hand's functionality. But she had done it. She had played for the living and the dead. She had reminded them all, prisoners and captors alike, that humanity still existed somewhere beneath the uniforms and the cruelty. Word of the concert spread through the camp that night. The full story, embellished and mythologized with each retelling. She played forbidden music, and they didn't shoot her. She made the Germans cry. She won. But Natalia knew she hadn't won. She had simply survived, and her hands might never play again. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. A German guard came to the barracks during work detail. He was looking for Natalia. The women tensed. This was it. Delayed punishment. Execution. But the guard handed her a package. Inside was a medical kit, bandages, antiseptic, salve for frostbite, and a note in German. "For your hands, so you can play again. W.B. Wilhelm Bauer." The young corporal who had cried during the concert. He had risked court-martial to steal medical supplies for a Soviet prisoner. Natalia treated her hands. Over the following weeks, other small acts of mercy followed. Extra food rations appeared at her bunk, a pair of mittens, a blanket, always anonymous, always from German guards who had been at the concert. Hoffman never spoke of it again. He avoided Natalia completely. Some said he had been ordered by Berlin to forget the incident. Others said he couldn't face what he had witnessed, that a starving prisoner had demonstrated more humanity and courage than he ever would. Natalia survived the war. Stalag 9C was liberated by American forces on April 11, 1945. She weighed 34 kilograms. She could barely walk. Her hands had permanent damage. 3 fingers never regained full sensation. But she could still play. After the war, Natalia returned to Leningrad. The city was rebuilding. Of her 72 students, only 8 had survived the siege. She gathered them together, and they gave a concert. The Shostakovich Seventh, the Leningrad Symphony, in full, with orchestra, not just piano. The concert hall was packed, 4,000 people. Many cried through the entire performance. It was not just music, it was memory. It was survival. It was proof that beauty had outlived barbarism. Natalia continued to teach until 1981. She trained a new generation of Soviet pianists. Many became famous. All remembered her story. The teacher who had stayed when she could have fled, who had played in bomb shelters, who had defied her captors with music. She died in 1987 at age 77 in her apartment overlooking the Neva River. The Leningrad she had loved, the city that had survived, the civilization that had refused to die. At her funeral, they played a recording of her performing the Shostakovich Seventh. Her hands might have been damaged, her technique imperfect from the prison camp injuries, but the emotion, the defiance, the sheer humanity in her playing was overwhelming. Wilhelm Bauer, the German guard who had given her the medical kit, attended the funeral. He was 71 years old. He had become a music teacher in Stuttgart after the war. He never spoke publicly about his time as a guard at Stalag 9C, but he traveled to Leningrad for Natalia's funeral because, as he told her surviving students, "She reminded me I was human when I had forgotten. I owe her my soul." The Bechstein piano from the officers' club at Stalag 9C survived the war. It was found by American soldiers and eventually made its way to a military museum. In 2003, it was donated to the Leningrad Conservatory, where Natalia had taught. It sits in the main concert hall now. On a brass plaque, "The Piano of Resistance," played by Dr. Natalia Kozlova, December 19, 1944, Stalag 9C. The keys still have faint stains, blood from damaged fingers. They tried to clean them, but the wood had absorbed too deeply. So they left them, as a reminder. Because that's what Natalia understood that her captors didn't. That beauty is not fragile. It's the strongest force humanity possesses. Stronger than guns. Stronger than hatred. Stronger than cruelty. You can imprison it. You can try to humiliate it. You can even try to kill it, but you cannot make it disappear as long as one person remembers. As long as one person refuses to forget. As long as one person is willing to bleed onto piano keys to prove that civilization still exists. Now you. Did you know that female Soviet POWs included artists, doctors, and intellectuals who were deliberately humiliated but found ways to resist through their professions? Have you heard other stories of prisoners who used their skills to preserve humanity in the darkest circumstances? Tell me in the comments what other untold stories of female prisoners of war you think deserve to be remembered, because history has forgotten too many women whose courage was quieter than battles, but just as powerful.